Hello and welcome back to another installment of Introduction to Windows Server 2012 and 2016 Administration. My name is Scott Neal, and during this series we're going to be covering a lot of the MOAC 70-410 installation and configure Windows Server 2012 exam certification. This covers, of course, 2012 R2, but a lot of what we're going to be talking about in this series does pertain to Server 2016 as well. We're going to be covering in this series, if you can recall, we're going to be looking at basic administrative tasks from the ground up. We're going to be approaching this. A lot of what we're going to be talking about in this series does pertain to Active Directory. So one of the best ways to learn Active Directory is literally start from the ground up and work our way up by creating a domain and building out that domain for an organization. So in this episode, we're going to be looking at Exam Objective 5.1, Installing Domain Controllers. This actually covers Lesson 13. If you're following along in the Microsoft 70-410 book. We're going to be introducing Active Directory today. We're going to be looking at things like organizational units versus subdomains. We're going to introduce you to our organization that we're going to be using over the next several weeks in our series. We're going to be talking about the Fish and Chicky Tuna organization. We're going to be also demonstrating deploying Active Directory domain services by building a domain controller before we end our episode today. So I want to go ahead and get started. So what is Active Directory? Well, Active Directory, quite simply put, is a directory service. And Active Directory, by no means, is the only directory service out there. I learned or cut my teeth on Novell's directory service. A directory service really is a repository of information about the resources, whether those resources are hardware, software, whether they're people, whether they're data, anything that's connected to a specific network. We take that information and we store it really in a bunch of databases, and those databases reside on something called a domain controller. Active Directory, of course, is Microsoft's variation of a directory service. It is pretty much the industry standard. So if you're going to be a Windows Server admin out there in the field, working in organizations, working in domains, working in Active Directory is going to be a fact of life for you. A domain, well, domain really is just a fundamental logical container of network components hosted by at least one server. That server is the domain controller. Microsoft will be quick to point out, however, that most domains should have more than one domain controller for redundancy purposes. So users, computers, applications throughout the network can all access this database, this repository of information, for lots of reasons. For starters, user authentication and authorization. So the user will need to authenticate to a network, just like you would authenticate to, if you go out to a nightclub, for instance, and you want to go into the nightclub, you have to authenticate yourself to the bar bouncer, right? So you produce a driver's license. Well, in Windows world, that driver's license is a token, and you acquired that token by logging into the network by providing either a password, providing a fingerprint or a retina scan, or maybe you have a smart card. Basically, you are authenticating with these resources. And if you use two or more of these resources, you have authenticated with something called multi-factor authentication. Authenticating is really about proving that you are who you are. Authorization, on the other hand, is slightly different. Authorization is really about determining what level of access you have to a resource. So even though you produce a driver's license to the person at the bar, and he looks at the driver's license and you successfully authenticate by showing a valid driver's license, several things could happen. He could look at the driver's license and determine that you're not old enough to go into the bar, and therefore you do not have access to the bar. No access. He may look on the guest list and see that you are a VIP, in which case you have complete access to the bar. You have access to the upper level, and you can drink wine and champagne all night long with the owner of the nightclub. You may end up with standard user access, and you may only be limited to the downstairs portion where the bands are. Or maybe you had a few drinks and you went out and took up a chair at the nightclub last week and smashed it on somebody and you got thrown out of the bar, in which case when you came back tonight you realized you were denied access. Now, of course, deny access or denied usually trumps all other privileges. But we'll talk more about that, particularly when we start getting into files, file servers, and looking at permissions. But the key thing here is remembering that authentication is all about proving that you are who you are, while authorization is about looking at and determining the level of access you have to a specific resource. So what else can you do with domains? Well, we may access that repository and look for things like the storage and configuration of data. How should something be configured when it's brought online? We may use the domain to determine how we can access files, applications, and network devices. So there is a wide variety of things we can do with a domain, and we'll talk a lot more about domains as we progress further in the series. Active Directory is hierarchical, just like a file server, and it is scalable in both directions, which means that it can get as big as my organization is, or it can be as small as I want it. Domains can also be subdivided. I can look at a domain and break it down into multiple components. I can break it down into organizational units and populate each organizational unit with objects. Objects really is just a simple word for resources, and every resource in the domain is considered an object, whether that is a person, a computer, whether that is data, whether that is an application, and so on, or a network device. All those are resources and therefore are objects. We also can set up trust relationships with other domains, and so we may have, Scott.com may purchase Wilbur.com, and I build a relationship between those two organizations so that my company can administer their company. When then we have that two-way trust developed, then they become part of our infrastructure and they become part of our forest. So the entire hierarchical grouping, whether I'm dealing with one domain or a grouping of domains and subdomains, is all called a forest. But if I create one domain and it is a domain unto itself, it is the first domain that we have created, it will be simply called the forest root domain. So we talked about objects, and one of the things about objects is that every object has a level of attributes associated with it. So if I have a user, any user in my domain has a set of attributes that I can give to that user. For instance, first name, last name, middle initial, title, location, member groups that they're members of. These are all attributes that identify and categorize that user. So every object has a different set of attributes that can be applied to it. When I went and got my driver's license, if you look on your driver's license, you notice that you are categorized on your driver's license from everything from your hair color, your height, your weight, your race, your where you live, what type of vehicle you can drive. These are all the attributes that identify you. And I can, if I go purchase a car, we identify a car differently. Make, model, color, style, hard top or soft top, or no top at all. But those attributes are different. We wouldn't use those attributes when we went and got our driver's license. You're not going to pull out a driver's license and say, oh, you're a hard top. So those attributes are different. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is that attributes are all going to be determined by something called a schema. We'll get to that in a minute. Each forest does have a global catalog, which is really just a list of the objects in the forest, along with a subset of each object's attributes. And every object in the domain, or every object really in Microsoft World, has something attached to it called an access control list, also abbreviated as an ACL. And that ACL quite simply is kind of like the guest list at that bar that you went to. If it's a private bar, you're on the membership list or you're not on the membership list. And if you're on the membership list, you're probably categorized as to what level of access you have to the bar. So that access control list is very similar in the sense that it will determine who has access to the resource and what level of access to the resource it has. You as a user do not carry around that access control list. You don't have an index of everything you have access to. On the contrary, all you have is that driver's license, and you have on the driver's license per se, or the token, it also identifies you as to what groups you belong to. We'll talk about groups later. But anyway, each object has an access control list. It stays with the object. Different objects, as I said, have different attributes depending on their function, and the directory schema is going to identify which attributes for each object are present, and will define that on each object. So there are occasions when you may need to do what's called extending the schema. Introduction of SCCM, an application, a very powerful application by Microsoft that lets you do a lot of back-end management on your network, requires certain schema attributes to be added to users, computers, and so on that are not present in the domain out of the Active Directory, out of the box. And so those have to be added in, and that's called extending the schema. Extending the schema is a one-way street. So it's not uncommon when you start talking about extending the schema that people start getting a little nervous and they start having meetings because they realize that if whatever you're doing doesn't work, there's no way to remove those attributes after you've added them. Okay, so while we're talking about objects, it's probably good to define leaf objects versus container objects. A leaf object, quite simply, cannot have subordinate objects. These include containers, users, computers, groups, applications, networked resources. These are all leaf objects. And you think to yourself immediately, you say, well, group, I can put things in a group. People are members of group. Computers are members of group. They are, but they're not subordinate to the group. The group simply catalogs them and says these are like objects. So in Microsoft world, that makes them a leaf object. Some people have a hard time with that. Container objects, domains, organizational units, these are container objects. And if I put something in a container object, then the rules that I have assigned to that container object will be dictated to the objects within those containers. So domains and organizational units are the two big container objects that we talk about, and they are anything I put in it will become subordinate to the rules I set up for it. We'll talk about organizational units again in a little bit. So here's just a good example. This is a typical user property screen. And as you can see, there are lots of attributes associated with this user. There are tabs and tabs of attributes. But if I sit and look at it, and look at the types of things, first name, initials, last name, display name, so on and so forth, these are all being dictated by the schema for Active Directory. All right, so domains and organizational units. Domains are usually the top level or the root of the directory structure, also known as a domain tree. So in our example, we're going to be creating a domain called fishychicky.com. www.fishychicky.com is a domain. It's a registered domain that someone has purchased, right? And because it's registered, it can be used on the internet. We don't have to do that. We can create a domain out of anything. And indeed, FishyChicky, I don't know if it's real or not, but FishyChicky is a unregistered domain, but we can still use it for the purposes of administering Active Directory management to our internal resources. Organizational units, as I said before, are container objects within the domain. They're used to divide the security and administrative responsibility among several divisions or departments. They function in a subordinate capacity to the domain. That means that if I set a rule at the top level or in the domain, then organizational units by default will have to abide by that rule. If I do not set a rule in the top level, then I have the ability in the organizational unit to set a rule that can be followed by subordinate units. We have other little tricks. We can disable inheritance like you can in a file system. So this is not absolute. But in general, think of the domain hierarchy like a waterfall. That water continues to flow downhill. The same premise also applies to file servers or file trees. Concept is identical. I can nest OUs within OUs. I can put leaf objects within OUs, which is actually how I would very easily allow those rules to propagate. So when we start talking about group policy, we'll really start looking at OUs in earnest, because really, I tell my students there are two real reasons why to create an OU. When we do this course, one of the first things they do when I give them their organizational chart is to immediately create organizational units for every department in the organization. And they say, well, it makes it look good, whatever. But every organizational unit requires a certain level of administrative overhead. And unless you are changing the rules of the game for those particular items, or, so with group policy, for instance, I need a separate desktop for a group of users, or they're going to have access to different resources that I'm going to propagate through group policy, then I don't need an organization unit. The other example of when I would need an organizational unit is if I'm going to delegate a group of people to manage those resources. And we do that in large organizations. If you go to universities, for instance, every school in the university usually is represented as an organizational unit, because we have IT teams in those schools, and we don't want the IT teams to have access to the root of the domain, because then they can affect change to the entire school infrastructure. So we give them access or delegate access to small little worlds where they can control the group policies for their faculty, their students, and their whatever, without affecting change globally on the domain. So if one or both of those rules apply when you're testing a group of objects and saying, this group of objects, what am I doing with it? Then an organizational unit is warranted. Otherwise, we can probably use a security group to manage those resources. We'll look at all that in more detail later. All right, so let's move on. Subdomains. There are times when you may opt to further divide a domain into subdomains. But unlike organizational units, subdomains in a tree is like starting all over again. They do not inherit permissions and policies from parent domains. So subdomains, they will allow you to divide your domain, your domain name, your website into sections or separate areas. You can organize things, particularly things that are very dissimilar. If I have, some sort of, all the way across the country, I have another division of my company, and they're going to be playing by a totally different set of rules, different password requirements, different everything. Probably, it may be that the easiest way for me to do that is just go ahead and create a subdomain. They have a totally different IT staff. The only thing we're really looking for is the trust relationship so that our executives can have access to resources and so on. A subdomain may be warranted. But you have to remember that subdomains do increase operational overhead, and they do introduce the potential for policy inconsistencies across the network. An example of a subdomain in our example would be fishychickie.com and then seattle.fishychickie.com. So let's talk about Fishy Chickie. Well, for the next few weeks, when we start building out our domain and we start going into talking about Active Directory, we're going to be talking about Fishy Chickie as our example. Fishy Chickie, for our purposes, Fishy Chickie canneries, markets. So let's talk about
So, speaking of fishy chicky canneries, our example that we're going to be using over the next several weeks is a cannery that markets canned tuna. Canned tuna, of course, is a staple food. It's been around since the early 1900s. It produces canned tuna products for delivery nationwide. Our example is located in Seattle, Washington. And fish, of course, are delivered to the canneries. They're frozen, they're refrigerated, and then we process them and can them and turn them into delicious treats. Then they're delivered to wholesalers across the continent. So, well, let's look at Fishy Chicky in more detail. So this is the organizational chart for Fishy Chicky. And as you can see, it does have a board, a CEO. Mr. Alex Truman is the president and CEO of Fishy Chicky. And if you sit there and you look at how this organization is broken down, we basically have four division heads. We have a legal department, we have the vice president of production, a vice president of operations, and finance and accounting is kind of set off all to itself as well. Vice President of Production has significant responsibilities, from production planning, quality assurance, and even running the plant. We do have a plant manager. He's in charge of 3 shifts, a warehouse division, and of course plant maintenance. If you look at the Vice President of Operations, Sally also has significant responsibilities, and hers cover human resources, our IT department, sales and marketing, and procurement. So for our example, we're going to assume that we have been hired by Fishy Chicky, brought into the IT department, and our job is to build out a new domain for Fishy Chicky so that they can change their infrastructure. So what's one of the first things that you're going to want to do when you start thinking about building out Active Directory? Well, one of the things we're going to want to do is look at this organizational chart and start building relationships between people and departments. You'll also notice that in each of these departments we have varying number of staff. The staff range anywhere from 1 staff to 2 staff, all the way up to 50 staff in some, like Shift 2 has 50 staff in Shift 2. And anyways, we're going to start thinking about, as IT planners and IT administrators, who needs to talk to who? What are the similarities between these divisions, departments? Who needs to share information? Who's going to need access to whose resources? And then we're going to start mapping that Active Directory tree out in our minds, or even on a sheet of paper, and start thinking about, all right, so, public relations probably needs a group for public relations. Let's just create a group for that right now. Say these are public relations people. And public relations will have public relations and maybe even outreach, or maybe outreach is a subgroup in public relations. We're going to start thinking about building this out and how it's going to look in Active Directory. Over the next few weeks, we're going to we're going to build an example. And bear in mind, this is just an example, one example of how this organization will look in Active Directory. There are multiple ways we can do this, and a lot of things are going to be variables in that. Our management style, our infrastructure, what rules and policies are being dictated to us, and our IT staff, management style. All these things are going to be factors in how we build this out. So as we move forward over the next several weeks, there are probably going to be instances where you're going to go, why didn't we do this? Why didn't we do that? Oh, that's neat. I would have done it this way, but I like this way better. Just remember that are there wrong ways to do this? Yeah, there are. But there are a lot of right ways to do this as well. All right, so let's move on. Let's begin today by building our domain controller. So I'll go ahead and let's move into the demonstration phase. Okay, so welcome to the demo portion of today's exercise. We are going to be building a domain controller today using a Server 2012 R2 standard server. You'll maybe notice, if you remember from previous episodes, that I have changed the computer name to FCDC for Fishy Chicky Domain Controller. And if I go into here, you can see that I have
actually change that computer name by going into the computer name domain changes and changing it here. Simply say OK, and then do a restart of the box. That's a pretty simple way to change the name. Another thing we need to actually do today is create a password that's significantly safe enough for our new domain admin password. The local users and groups, very important piece of information. The local users and groups, when I convert this into a domain controller, this is the only time when local users and groups will cease to exist on a machine. So there will be no more local users and groups once I have created a domain on this box, as far as this box being concerned. One of the things that I will have to have is what Windows will consider a secure password. And that secure password, of course, has to have a variation of characters, preferably 8 characters or longer. So I want to go ahead and make sure that that doesn't hinder me when I start to actually set up my domain. So I've gone in, I've created a new password. I could also change the name here, but I'm not going to do that because I'm really going to be referring back to the administrator account several times, and I really don't want any questions about what that is. But if this were a production environment and a production box, I would most certainly change the name of the administrator account here to something other than administrator, so that it's not as easy to identify in the event that someone does get into the box. Alright, I've changed that. So let's go ahead and start thinking about promoting this to a domain controller. So I'm going to add my roles and features, and I'm going to go down here. This is just a little, the wizard page here. We're going to say role-based, feature-based installation. We want it on this server. Right now it's the only server that we can select from. And we're going to look for Active Directory Domain Services. So we're going to select that option here. Okay, and it says it's going to have to add several different types of features. It's going to add the remote server administration tools, role administration tools, the ADDS and LDAP tools. It's going to add the Active Directory module for Windows PowerShell, and so on. So we're going to go ahead and include those as well as the management tools if they're available. And we're going to say next. All right, so that should do it for that. Let's say next. And next. What are we adding? Yep, that looks about right. And install. The installation process will take just a few minutes. Okay, so we have completed the installation process for the Active Directory role. We're going to go ahead and close this. And as you can see, we now have a flag up here that we need to take a look at. And we're going to promote this server to a domain controller. That begins the promotion wizard. We're going to, for our purposes, we're going to add a new forest. Now, if we were adding another domain, because as I said before, Microsoft loves the idea of having multiple domain controllers in a domain. And we'll talk a little bit about how that works in the next segment. But then we would select this, add a domain controller to an existing domain. We could also add a new domain to an existing forest. That's if we're going to have a fairly large organization. We've developed a new company or something like that. We want a separate domain for that company. We have the ability to do that. But since we're starting off, this is going to be just one domain. We're just going to say add a new forest. All right, and what are we going to call the actual domain? We're going to call it fishychicky.com. Okay, and we're going to say next. All right, so now it's going to begin the promotion process. We have some options that we're going to have to select. the forest functional level and the domain functional level. So one of the things we have not really talked about yet, it's really safe for the next segment, is this concept of functional level. Key thing to remember about functional level is that the functional level of your domain must be the level at which your lowest domain controller exists. So if I've got a domain and I've got, I don't know, two 2016 boxes, a 2012 box, and one 2008 server box, my functional level must be server 2008. And the reason being is that with each server upgrade, there are new features and add-ons for Active Directory services, but unless all of the boxes can talk that language, then you cannot make use of those features. You also have to remember that forest functional levels or increasing forest functional levels, kind of like increasing the schema, is a one-way trip. You can't go backwards. So it's important that you decommission your older servers, your servers that are downstream, that get those off your domains before you raise the functional level of your domain. So because this is the only domain controller on our domain, it is a server 2012 R2 box, our functional level will be R2 2012. So as you can see, if I use the drop-down menu here, I do have several options: server 2008, 2008 R2, server 2012, server 2012 R2. You'll notice that server 2003 is not listed. All right, so we're going to create a directory services restore mode password. All right, and that's just to help us recover from any catastrophic directory service issues. Okay, and we're going to say next. All right. The delegation for this DNS server cannot be created because an authoritative parent zone cannot be found. All this really means is that I don't see a DNS server. I don't have an authoritative DNS server that we can use. So what does that mean for us? Well, DNS is integral to domain services. And because we don't have a downstream DNS server, not a registered domain, we are going to have to build a DNS server when we build this domain controller. The domain controller will do that for us. So we won't have to really go into DNS so much right now. So no action is really required from us given this, this expression here. So we're going to say next. And the wizard continues to build. So this is our NetBIOS domain name. You'll see that a NetBIOS domain name more often than not is just the name of your domain without the suffix. Okay, so we have moved on to the next segment of our configuration wizard. This is really just asking us whether or not we want to accept the default folder and file locations for some key elements necessary for Active Directory. The database folder, the log files folder, and the sysvolume folder. We're just going to accept these defaults. But we could change them, or we could even put them on some sort of a remote share drive if we really wanted to, but we're not going to do that. Now we're just reviewing our options. We're looking at the options that we've chosen for our domain controller. And we're going to say next. Now it's going to run a prereq check. And it will give us a list of warnings based upon whether or not we have met all the prereqs necessary to actually complete the process of creating this domain. Okay. So we're back. We do have some issues that we need to resolve. So one of the things that we don't have here at the present moment is a static IP address assigned to its IP properties. So
Also, the delegation for this DNS server cannot be created. Everything else seems to be okay. Yeah, so all this is fine for us. Sometimes you're going to get some additional warnings. For instance, if your administrator password does not have, you don't have an administrator password on your box, or the administrator password does not meet the qualifications, you'll get a warning for that. If the Server 2012 operating system allows the administrator account not to have a password, you will get a warning and you won't be able to proceed for that either. That's going to require you to do some command line configurations using the net user command. We don't have to do that in this particular build, but there are instances where that is necessary. One of the big things that DNS servers do like, though, is static IP addresses, and we've talked about having a static IP address for this box. I'm going to leave this as it is since it's a demo box, but bear in mind that in the production world, we would have an IP address that's static for the box. We are going to go ahead and configure these domain services now for the machine. The box continues to build. You'll see that there's you get a progress screen here. It goes through all the little settings that it's created. Alright, so our box has finished building the domain resources. We are going to be kicked off the box while the box restarts. Bear in mind, when we come back to this box, we will no longer have a local administrator account. We're going to have a domain administrator account, and this will be the domain administrator account for the entire domain. So this now becomes a very important username and password. It is not something that you share with all your IT staff. It's certainly nothing you share with your users. This is one of those closely guarded secrets. Your domain administrator account and password shared only to a couple people, and then it's taken and locked in a safe somewhere in case those two people suddenly turn up dead somewhere. We use the practice of least privilege for our IT staff, which means that our IT staff are delegated responsibilities, and then their accounts are tailored so that they can accomplish those jobs and nothing more. We don't give the keys to the kingdom to everybody. So that's a very important point to make here as this box restarts for the first time as Fishy Chickie's first domain controller. So now we'll log in with those credentials instead of the box credentials. Okay, so welcome back. That took a couple minutes for it to rebuild and add those domain properties to the box. We are going to log back into the box. As you can see, our credentials have changed, so we're going to have to log in with a different account. We're now going to log in as administrator and password. Alright, so we're now logging into the domain controller for the first time. And I am actually logging in with the domain administrator account for the box. So if I look at the box, you'll notice that some things have changed. For one thing, you'll see that we do have two new roles. We have Active Directory Domain Services, and we have DNS. DNS is required for Active Directory to work. So since it didn't detect it's a DNS server that it could attach itself to, it created one by itself. And if I go into my my IPv4 settings for the NIC card on this box, you will see that it points to itself for DNS. I'm going to also go and show you, if I go into the tools section here, you will see that I have got some additional tools for us to use. Active Directory Administrative Center, Domains and Trusts, Windows PowerShell for Active Directory, Active Directory Sites and Services, and Active Directory Users and Computers. In addition to that, you'll see that I also have my DNS tools. So this is my DNS server. As you can see, in the DNS Manager, I have my global logs. I have 4 lookup zones pointing to fishychicky.com. I have no reverse lookups, no trust points, no conditional forwarders. This forward lookup zone is very important. And it's going to use this DNS box in order to determine when we start adding boxes to the network, adding servers to the network, they will have DNS entries. The Active Directory tools, on the other hand, are very cool. So if I go into Active Directory Users and Computers, you'll see that this is the, if you've been using Server in the past, Server 2003, perhaps this is what I refer to as the old school way of doing it. To me, it is probably still the most reliable way to add, create changes in Active Directory. We are looking at the default containers and organizational units for fishychicky.com. Built-in computers, domain controllers. This is an organizational unit, and as you can see that FCDC is a member of it. That is because the rules for the domain controllers are different than the rules for other computers on the network. Okay, foreign security principles, managed service accounts, and users. These are all the default users in the domain, and I'm not going to go through all of them. But the important ones, of course, the administrator. Okay, this was the one that was created earlier when we had just the box. We had that account created, and as you can see, it was also propagated to a domain account as well. Guest is always going to be part of the equation, deactivated by default, and then we have a bunch of other in here that allow us. They're pre-configured to allow us to do certain things: DNS admins, RODC accounts, and things like that nature. All right, so this is one way that we can go in and effect change. The other way in Active Directory is to the Active Directory Administrative Center, which I am starting up now. This is the Active Directory Administrative Center. And everything that I can do in the old school way, I can pretty much do here. So if I go into Active FishyChicky here, I can right click, I can say new. What do you want? I want a new user. Okay, and this is the way the user account interface comes up in the Active Directory Administrative Center. All of the items that are represented in the old school properties tabs are represented here, just maybe a little more condensed. Okay, and if I go into the old school method, things beginning to slow way down. I'm going to close out of this. And I'm going to go back into my old school method here. And if I go to users and I say new user. Okay, you'll see that I have a wizard here that I can fill out as well. So as we move forward in subsequent lectures, we're going to be adding users, we're going to be adding groups, we're going to be maybe adding 1 or 2 organizational units, and showing you how all this works in relation to how the organization works as a whole. And I look forward to having you follow me through the next few segments as we build out our Active Directory. So stay tuned, more good things coming down the road for us, and I look forward to seeing you.